Urbinary. The podcast exploring how we understand and live urban spaces.
Today we go back to San Siro, but not just to describe the contrast. We want to understand what's underneath it. How did Milan go from building thousands of homes for working-class families to treating houses as a leftover category? What happened to the idea of housing as a right?
Because if you look closely at San Siro, you don't just see decline. You see how that decline is managed. You see who gets left waiting for repair, for papers, for response, and who gets to move in next doors, behind the fences. This is not just a story about a neighbor in decay. It's a story about the governance, silence, and the slow disappearance of social guarantees.
We are Giulia, Michael, and Luyu, two international urban planning students and a PhD researcher at the Politecnico di Milano. And in this podcast, we try to read Milan for what it is, a city that's transforming, expanding, regenerating. But for whom? Welcome back. Urbinary returns with episode 2, Leaving the Divide, More Than a Roof.
Let's rewind. In the decades after World War II, Italian cities built thousands of homes for workers and families. It wasn't charity, it was policy. A way to stabilize cities, reduce rent, inflation, and expand welfare. But unlike healthcare or education, housing never gained a strong institutional footing. And so, when neoliberal reforms came, housing was one of the first sectors to shrink.
In the 90s, housing agencies were transformed into public companies. Budgets were cut, new construction stopped, maintenance was underfunded. We spoke with Alessandro Coppola, an urban planning professor at Politecnico di Milano, and Raffaella Saporito, who teaches public management at the SDA Bocconi. Each of them offered a different perspective on how Milan got here and what's at stake. First, here is Coppola.
It has given up to fund public housing since the last 25 years. We had a system that would fund public housing through the participation of workers and employees. This system was phased out in the late 90s, and since then there is no structural channel of funding for the construction and more the refurbishment of public housing. So this is a source of systemic failure, meaning that the cities do not have a reliable pot of national money to expand the supply of public housing.
And here is what Saporito had to say.
Public housing bodies were turned into regional companies without public funds for new buildings. So instead of building, they focus on managing what already exists and doing it with rent money alone.
But rent doesn't pay for elevators, or roofs, or structural work. Over time, the buildings aged, the waiting list grew, and the idea that housing was a right quietly disappeared.
And when that idea faded, so did responsibility. In its place, a single logic took hold. Manage what exists, stretch every euro, and if the system fails, blame the people stuck inside of it.
There is a high presence of elderly people, often alone, and also a significant presence of people with mental disorders, and in general with different kind of disability. So it's an individual fragility, but also a sort of a fragility of the community.
It's a complexity related to the material stock of the houses, but also the intangible heritage of people and stories. You see this most clearly in San Siro. It's one of the largest public housing areas in Milan, over 6,000 apartments, home to around 11,000 people, but nearly 400 units sit empty. Another 12 to 14% are occupied informally through squatting. This is not just abandonment, it's neglected by design.
And here's the irony. San Siro isn't some forgotten periphery. It's central, both geographically and symbolically. Most public housing in Milan is tucked away in the outskirts, out of sight, out of mind. But San Siro is different. It was once a peripheral district, until the city grew around it. Now it's well-connected, visible, and right at the edge of Milan's ambition. That visibility makes it harder to ignore, and that's precisely why it matters. San Siro has become a symbol of what public housing is and what it could still be. How the city treats San Siro is not just about one neighborhood. It's a message about the future of all public housing in Milan. And yet it's treated like an exception, a failure, a burden. We spoke with urban planning professor Francesca Cognetti of the Politecnico di Milano, whose voice you heard just moments ago. For over 10 years, she and her team have lived, researched, and collaborated in San Siro, not just as observers, but as participants in the neighborhood's everyday struggles for dignity and recognition.
And there is a sort of lack of recognition about the neighborhood as a source for the city. There is this very important stigma about the neighborhood and a very important narrative linked with the neighborhood as a problem, with a lot of security issues.
Meanwhile, just a few meters away, private developments rise. Same street, different logic. That's the first fracture, between the public and the private, between what gets invested in and what gets left behind. But there are fractures within San Siro too. Inside the same buildings, two very different realities coexist. Older tenants with secure pensions, living alone in large apartments. Newer families, often migrants, crowd into smaller flats, juggling instability and bureaucracy.
Now, public housing is meant to reduce inequalities, right? It's a public good in theory, and this should help people stay in the city, especially as cities get more and more exclusive, as Milan has become. But what we notice is kind of a paradox. Many public housing neighborhoods actually end up reproducing disadvantage rather than reducing it. We use interviews with tenants to explore personal stories and data analysis for demographic trends. And what we found is a growing divide, basically in two types of tenants. One is intergenerational. The working class 30 or 40 years ago had a better opportunity to access public housing with better conditions. Another difference is ethnical. People with migration background live in worse condition compared with, let's say, natives. So what happens? You've got two groups living in the same buildings, but with very, let's say, different needs, like serious needs. And that's create conflicts.
This is not just a story of poverty. It's a story of abandonment by design, of a policy that maintains just enough to avoid collapse, but never enough to support life.
In 2019, a Milanese architect proposed demolishing San Siro's public housing blocks and replacing them with vertical towers. His plan? Public-private partnerships, mixed-income housing, new green spaces. The media called it visionary. Residents called it erasure. Because San Siro isn't empty land. It's home to thousands of people. It's social infrastructure. Fragile, yes, but alive. Maintained not by institutions, but by people.
It's not the city that holds this together. It's the residents, through gardens, shared kitchens, informal sport. And as Francesca Cognetti told us, drawing more than 1 decade of work in San Siro, this is not just survival, it's a form of knowledge.
So, in my vision, it's very important to start to living the neighborhoods, to living in public housing stock, to really understand conditions, really understand living conditions and also perspectives and also aspirations from the neighborhood.
Her approach begins with presence, not planning from above, but staying, listening, and recognizing that even the most fragile lives hold insight. She calls her local laboratories, community-rooted ways of imagining housing justice from the ground up.
But what Cognetti describes is not just urban research. It's a diagnosis of policy failure, of institutions that have withdrawn, leaving behind fragmented agency, empty flats, and communities stretching thin. It's not just that people are left behind, it's that the system is no longer built to hold them. And while planners call for new approaches, many residents see a city that no longer listens. Some turn that disappointment into action, others into satire. We spoke with Iva Manupelli, aka Hurricane, a comic artist raised in the Milan suburbs. For him, what's happening in San Siro echoes what's happening across the city. In his latest comic book, Milano Horror Stories, he depicts a city haunted by gentrification, displacement, and broken promises. For Ivan, urban regeneration is not progress. It's a kind of erasure.
In Milan, in particular, there's this strong narrative, but it's also incredibly fake. The concept of week has almost no depth. Turning every cultural event into a week is intellectually embarrassing.
In una week è qualcosa di una povertà intellettuale imbarazzante. Il fatto di avere
Having a cultural commissioner who is completely uninterested in the city cultural and artistic realities, who does practically everything to discourage them unless they fit into this narrative, is another deeply embarrassing aspect.
non appartengono a questa narrazione è un'altra cosa molto imbarazzante.
San Siro reveals what happens when a city stops investing in inclusion, where policy turns from planning to management, from rights to control, from presence to absence.
And this logic doesn't stop at the edge of San Siro. It shapes Milan more broadly, in the rise of luxury towers, in the disappearance of social housing, in the normalization of eviction.
What kind of housing policy are we envisioning now? What kind of city are we trying to build? But public housing was never just about walls. It was a vision of a city where everyone, regardless of income, could belong. A city that saw housing not as a commodity, but as a public responsibility. If we listen to what's happening inside these neighborhoods, the stories, the resistances, the daily acts of maintenance, we see another picture. One where housing isn't just about shelter, but about belonging.
And the people fighting to stay? They are not resisting change. They are resisting erasure. San Siro is a place of contradiction, of decay and care, of violence and solidarity, of silence and voices that won't go quiet.
And that's why we went back, not just to look, but to listen.
Because what's happening in San Siro, it's not unique, it's just visible. And if we want to understand where Milan is going, we need to start with the places it's leaving behind.
Thanks for listening. This is Urbanary.
Urbanary is produced in collaboration with Polyradio and the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at Politecnico di Milano.